Without suffering, life is empty. It's for this reason that I drove 1,000 miles to the beach without a plan. Driving along the East Coast, dismayed to find the beauty of nature destroyed by drug addiction. The sort of drug addiction that springs up boxy condos and hotels condemned with pink paint and neon desecrations. Without addiction, none of these apartments would have been built or rented out. I parked my van in a place I thought to be legal and found a pathway onto the sand. I walked without destination, simply to observe. Here I found a new kind of suffering, a suffering of empathy. A man my same age hollered something at me, but I couldn't make out what he said and pretended not to hear. I wanted to observe the beach in the third person. Observe and nothing more. If I could have visited it in spirit, I would have, but the man got closer and asked me if I was from here. I told him I was only visiting. His beard was patchy. He didn't look like a burn victim, but I didn't know how else the hair of one's beard could grow in such a sporadic way. Without my inquiry, he offered to tell me that he lives in that apartment over there. Keeping him at a safe distance, I positioned my body to look at the apartment while keeping him in my peripheral in case of a sudden movement. While I gazed, he pulled something out of his pocket and I looked back at him. To his lips, he put a fat plastic pod which crackled before he exhaled a fruity flavored fume that corrupted the salty scent of the ocean. I commended his apartment, saying that it sounds awesome to live on the beach. Yeah, it's cool, he said. I'm taking care of my mom because my dad just died a few days ago. Oh, okay. I'm sorry to hear about your dad passing, I tell him. He says, no, it's all right. He was a drunk. I was taking care of him too before he croaked. There was an awkward pause. I wanted to be of practical value in the world, and here was a person who could use a friend or at least someone to listen to him. I wanted to care, convey to him that he's not alone, but I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to show him that I care. Then I started questioning whether or not I do care. If I don't care to give him compassion, he's not much different than myself, then there must be something wrong with me. What is wrong with me? I stopped drinking those things, he tells me, pointing to a guy sipping an energy can. They're so bad for you. My dad used to mix those things with vodka. Yuck. Yeah, there's a ton of ingredients in them. It's impossible to know what you're even drinking, I replied. Speed in a can, that's all it is. Might as well go over there under the pier and buy whatever dang baggies they're smoking out of. You know, when I was a kid, people didn't do that crap. We'd play under the pier, look for treasure. You know, cool-looking shells. I even got beat up down there one time. Somebody beat you up under the pier? Oh, yeah, I was exploring for treasure by myself, and he paused to put the smoke machine back to his lips. Some older kids were climbing down the rock smoking cigarettes. Those things are horrible for you, too. Anyway, he didn't see me because I was hiding behind one of the pilings. As they walked back to the beach, I circled behind the wooden column, moving my legs with the flow of the waves to stay silent. Finally, they were out from under the pier, back onto the beach, but I lifted my foot, and when I put it back down, it landed on a coral. I yelled in pain. They thought I'd been spying on them. I didn't want to tell them I was looking for treasure shells. They bloodied my ear and pummeled my eye swollen shut. I was mostly terrified to go home and let my dad see what happened. Why didn't you want your dad to see what happened? I asked. He explained, well, I had to go home, but before I did, I cleaned myself up as best as I could. And there was a pulsating buzz in my left ear and felt like a fever was expanding out of my cheek. I thought when I went home my dad would be so ashamed he'd finished the job. Instead, he saw me in the living room and said, you need to learn how to handle yourself. To that point, I always felt like he was disappointed at himself to have had a child. After that day, I realized he was disappointed to have me as a child. What a soulless clod of skin. From the distance, a girl shouted, Uncle Devin! And the stranger turned towards the voice and took another puff. The girl was running to the beach from where he'd pointed to as his apartment. Oh, that's my sister's daughter, Devin told me. Curiously, I asked, what did your mom say when you went home that day? He said, oh, she wasn't around. She was always gone. She only came back for good when she didn't have anywhere else to go. His niece then reached us, frantic. She struggled to catch her breath. Uncle Devin, Danny is really sick. He didn't want me to tell you, but he drank alcohol, a lot of alcohol. It was a bottle he found in the sand near the pier. He can't walk, Uncle Devin. He started falling down and vomiting. He needs 911. No, no, do not call 911. I'm not paying for an ambulance. He's really sick, Uncle Devin. I don't know what to do, she cried. I watched the young girl panic. She couldn't have been old enough to even drive. I interjected. Sounds like this guy is really ill. If it's about the ambulance, I could drive him to the hospital and get him help. Devin became harsh. Don't tell me how to treat my son. He's not going to the hospital. If he wants to drink, he better learn how to handle his liquor. The girl was lost and concerned for her cousin. Looking out somewhere for help, Devin finally said, give him some water, let him vomit, then get him into bed, put a trash can next to his bed so he doesn't make a mess. With that, the young girl ran back towards the apartments. Except for the waves whooshing and the receding foam, it was silent. A chilled breeze cut in from the horizon where only a sliver of the sun had yet to set, and the breeze caused the hairs on my forearm to stand. Devin mentioned, good talking to you. Enjoy your visit. And then he walked off towards the pier. I was thinking lately of philosophy and why I have such a apprehension to certain types of philosophy, because there's books that I've read in my life, and at the time that I read them, they had an incredibly beneficial impact on my mindset and the way that I viewed the world and my overall optimism and faith. And they're books like the Tao Te Ching, Meditations, The Shortness of Life. And I read those books several years ago, and lately I've been wondering, I'm like, all right, why do I have an apprehension to these sorts of philosophies now? And I went back and read the Tao Te Ching, and I've read the Shortness of Life. The Shortness of Life is short. It's a very short book, so I've read that several times in the past week. And as I've been reading these books, I've been observing myself reading, and I'm like, all right, what has been my issue with these sorts of philosophies? Why am I apprehensive when people carry these philosophies as though they're holding a truth? Why do I think that the thing that I have is truth and these are not real, despite the fact that they've been so beneficial in my life? And I realized that although these books seem to say a lot, they don't actually say anything. And the fact that they don't say anything is part of their profundity. I'm not taking anything away from them. But for example, the whole beginning of the Tao Te Ching, he's talking about the Tao. I think the author is Lao Oi or something along those lines. And he's just making a bunch of statements, and he's talking about the eternal, he's talking about the Tao and the eternal Tao, and another word for the eternal Tao, or another word for the Tao, maybe you could say, is the way. So the Tao is the way that you should live life. But he makes a distinction between the Tao and the eternal Tao, and he says the Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao. The way that can be named is not the eternal way. And the first few chapters are saying various different viewpoints of that same idea, and you do have to agree with it. It's true. Because for him to say that the eternal Tao, if you can name the Tao, if you can describe it with words, then that which you're describing is not actually the eternal Tao. It's not the highest good. That would be like in the West, or myself, saying that God is ineffable. That God is outside of space and time. Language itself is within space and time. And because language is within space and time, language is always changing, evolving, getting better. God is not evolving, getting better. God is perfect. God can't improve because God is already perfect. So just by the nature of language being inadequate, language can't actually describe God. There's no amount of words that can describe God. Not because humans can't know God, but because language itself is insufficient. But in regards to my apprehension to these philosophies, and one side note is the shortness of life says a similar the shortness of life says not a similar thing, but Seneca's the author, and Seneca is basically just tearing apart a bunch of different lifestyles that people have in Rome during that time period. And he's like, most people are too busy, and because they busy themselves, the things that they busy themselves are actually trivial, and they don't enjoy life, and they're not masters of their own time because they're busying their mind all of the time. That's what they're busying the mind for the sake of busying the mind. But then on the other side of the spectrum, there's other people who engage in leisure, and they go so far into leisure. He describes a man who he met, and this man was super wealthy, and he writes a whole chapter about this man because this man doesn't know whether or not he's sitting down. Seneca describes this guy as he's in a bathtub and he's sitting down in his bathtub, and then his maids or his servants, whatever, take him out of the bathtub, and he's standing, and then he asks them, he's like, am I sitting down right now? And Seneca writes a whole chapter about that because it's absurd. He's like, how can, just because that man's at leisure, how can that man be a master of his time if he doesn't even know whether or not he's sitting down? He doesn't know if he's standing up or sitting down. He's not a master of his time. He is not an admirable man. So that's what the shortness of life does, is it describes multiple different spectrums, and it describes this person on this end of the spectrum, this end of the spectrum. But he never, it was pre-Christianity, and he never describes what he does or maybe what one should do, rather than be on both sides of this spectrum. So the reason why I say that neither of these philosophies, Eastern philosophy, just Eastern philosophy in general, I love it, but I have to speak what is true within what I believe to be true. And my problem with it is that inherently every philosophy has a perspective on death. It has a declaration as to what death is. And even if a philosophy, part of the philosophy is to have no attitude towards death, no attitude towards death is a philosophy of death as well. So there's no escaping it. There's only two things that exist. There's only two things that we know about, and it's life and death. So you can have a philosophy towards life, but you have to have a perspective over what death is, and if you don't have a perspective of what death is, the weird contradiction is that that's a perspective as well. No perspective is a perspective. So I was introspecting and I was observing, and I realized that my apprehension towards digesting these types of philosophies too much or adopting them within myself and believing them to be the closest thing that humans have done to reach the truth, the closest articulation of the truth, is because within me is a belief in resurrection. I have a belief of resurrection. And it really is such a strange thing because I wouldn't call it a belief in resurrection. I literally just called it that, but the point I'm making is that we use the word faith, and people are like, well, do you believe in God? And they're like, no, I have faith in God. And it's like, well, what does that mean? What's the difference between believing in God and having faith in God? And what I would say is that my belief towards the resurrection, maybe you'd use the word evolved, maybe you would use the word resurrection. I died, all of my beliefs died, and what was born out of it was a new thing entirely that wasn't a belief, but it was a faith, and it was a faith in resurrection. And I stumble over my words when talking about it a bit because it's a great unknown. It is a great unknown thing because what does that even mean to resurrect? What does resurrection even mean? And I would say everybody has a perspective towards death. And again, if you have no perspective, that's a perspective as well. And the way that you view death informs you of life. The way that you view whatever death is, the passing away from this life, whatever you think that is and view it to be, it informs the way that you should live life in the here and now. It's constantly always informing the way that you should live life in the here and now. And you can open your heart to that sort of belief, or you can stay closed. And when you open your heart, it's hard to articulate the actual truth of it, but when you start to explore, when you develop a faith, when you have that positive faith, when you have this thing that is like optimism at the hierarchy, that your top belief, it's above everything else, it is your relationship with God, and you open your heart to that, then you're like, you go to a church or you're even just outside and you see a cross and you see a man who you see a motif, an image, a statue or whatever it is of a individual on a cross, and you're like, why is that there? Why is there a man on a cross? Why does that exist? Why is that in so many places? What does that mean? And the way that death informs you of life is that the way that death informs you about life is that the question is, what should I do with my life? What should I do with my time, my energy? What should I do with my body? And I'm not saying we're separate from our bodies and that we're not our bodies. We're kind of like multiple things: mind, body, and spirit, mind, body, and soul. But your body is the aspect of yourself that behaves, that participates in the material world. And nobody nobody seriously argues that the material world isn't real, because that sort of belief doesn't actually work in reality. If you don't believe reality is real, that doesn't make sense. So you have a body, and your body is participating in the world, and you've got time, and you're like, what should I do with my body? How should I act? And then you see crosses and a man who has been crucified on the cross, and it's maybe you'd call it a little bit morose. It's certainly solemn. But among many other things, what that cross means is it is telling you that that is the best thing that you can do with your body, because you're like, all right, I'm born into this world. I've got time. What is the best way that I can spend my time? Maybe I should procreate. Maybe I should try to garner a bunch of wealth and then redistribute it, or create a dynasty of a new family that I've created. There's so many things that you could do, and then you look at a cross and it gives you the answer. You're like, and it's like, that's what you should do with your body. And it's like, what? The best thing I could do with my body is the glory of the body is for it to be crucified. Because in the Bible, Jesus Christ says, deny yourself and carry your cross. So deny whatever worldly desires that you have. Pick up your cross and follow me. And we say pick up your cross and follow me, and people use that sort of terminology, but we don't always convey the entirety of what that means. And what that literally means is Jesus Christ was in the desert, faced temptations of the world, denied all of the temptations, denied the desires of the body, and instead carried his own cross to his crucifixion. And that's the glory of the body. That's the greatest thing that you could possibly do with the body. And people talk bad about Jesus Christ maybe, and they try to denigrate him. But rarely will you ever hear the argument that Jesus Christ isn't the greatest man who's ever lived. Almost in any religion, they might not say the greatest man that ever lived, but it's a weird motif that exists within the human subconscious or the collective conscious, that we just know, people just all believe, yeah, that man seemed to be without sin. As the story goes, and even if you have a very secular viewpoint, you're like, yeah, he was a great teacher. He seemed to be without sin. I don't know what to do with that information. So people don't deny that, and you see anybody sees Jesus Christ crucified on the cross, and it's like they don't deny that is a incredibly admirable act that he undertook. But he said to deny yourself and carry your cross as well, that we have to deny ourselves and carry our cross as well. And I think about that often, especially when I am doing physically arduous things like running in the scorching Florida heat, and my legs are hitting the concrete and it kind of hurts my joints, and excuses come up in my mind like maybe we maybe I shouldn't be doing this because it's hurting my body and maybe there'll be long-term effects. But oddly enough, it's a small voice within my head, but I know the sacrifice is worth it. I know that the joints that I have are temporary, and yeah, I don't want to be in a wheelchair when I'm older or have bad joints or anything like that, but something about the sacrifice, you can't let, you just have, the sacrifice is the greatest thing that you can do. You have to keep sacrificing. So if I think everybody's got to do a physical sacrifice, i.e., they've got to do hard things via their body. They've got to labor, and maybe I believe you've got to train as well. But sacrifice is necessary. Sacrifice is certainly necessary. And so where does sacrifice lead? Why would I not listen to those greater voices saying don't run because your joints hurt and things like that? And one of the things I meditate is not only do I meditate, but when I run, I almost always try to find a cross within the city and do the furthest point that I reach, I run from a spot to a different spot, and that different spot that I run to is the cross, and I circle the cross, and then I come back, and I make the sign of the cross as well. Because part of it is the inspiration and the motivation, because I believe that it's true that is actually the greatest thing that you can do with your body is to say martyrdom doesn't do it justice because that word has become convoluted, but there's no greater love than to sacrifice for a friend. There's no greater love than to lay your life down for a friend. And the faith that I have is, it's really hard to put it into words because I can't really say much else than resurrection. And resurrection itself is a scary, scary thing because you start to think of heaven and hell, and you maybe aren't sure what either one of those two things are, but then you go down a bad path in your life and you become hedonistic and you chase pleasure and you chase the desires of the world, and you realize that pathway is actually empty, and that the desires of the world, the things that brought you pleasure, is actually the thing that leads to hell. And then you get a taste of hell and you're like, well, I don't want to be anywhere near that. I need to be close to God. How can I get close to God? But the moving towards heaven is a trembling thing as well. It is a terrifying thing as well. You have a moment of bliss, of joy, because you're like, well, I'm going to move away from hell. But then you start to move towards heaven, and you become divided. And Jesus Christ talks in the Bible that he didn't come to unify the world. He came to divide the world. He came to bring a sword to the world, and he's going to chop it down. He's going to divide a house. It's going to be 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. And that's what happens within us as well, that you start to move towards God and you become divided because you have worldly desires that tell you to go in one direction, and God tells you to go into a different direction. And then when you go into the direction that isn't the one that God is telling you to go in, the part of you that yearns for God, that wishes to go towards God, is mourning and critical of that other part. But that other part of you never goes away because we exist in the world. We exist within space and time. We exist within a body. And the division The division shows you your flaws. You have something like a seed inside of you of the kingdom of God. That seed grows. You become more aware of how flawed you are, and it's almost like you just don't want to face the judgment of God, because things within you start unraveling and you realize how bad your past has actually been, how you've missed out on the good that you could have done, and you have done bad. You've harmed other individuals. And not only that, you're doing it again today. We aren't perfect today. Yes. Yes. So, deny yourself and carry your cross. Why do we have a cross to carry? In this story that I told, it is among other things, a story of generational curse. This individual who I met on the beach had something, he had been wronged by his father, but rather than understanding that he'd been wronged by his father and seeing the pain that he caused him, it's like that quote that there was an alcoholic father and he had two sons. One of the sons became an alcoholic, the other never drank alcohol, and they asked both sons, "Why do you not drink alcohol?" And they asked both of the sons why they made the decisions that they made, and they both said, "Because my father was an alcoholic." So in that story, the man who I'm talking to on the beach carried forth his original sin. He carried forth the sins of his father. And he doesn't have his own belief. He picked up that momentum, and wherever his father got those beliefs, wherever his dad got those beliefs to treat him that way, maybe it came from the dad, maybe it probably didn't. It's probably been there for generations. But I think it's crucially important to not live for a belief that you wouldn't die for. Do not live for a belief that you wouldn't die for. Meaning, don't hold within yourself don't hold something to be true to the point that it dictates your life. If you were to confront death and you still had this thing within you, and they're like, "Well, are you willing to die for this thing that you're holding as true? If you're not willing to die for it, why would you live for it?" And that's what this belief of the resurrection has become for me. It is me as well, but it's like a spirit that lives inside of me, and I wouldn't say that I antagonize it or I criticize it, but I do try to hit it with a hammer constantly to make sure that it's true. And it's always solid. It always remains no matter what. It's always the rock that the rest of the world has cast aside. It's the rock that the builder cast aside, of which God made the cornerstone. That is that truth of resurrection that I hold within me. And I live for it. And it's a strange, I keep saying it's a strange thing, but the reason why it's a strange thing is because I almost can't help it. And that's why I talk about it so often, because I want to share with other people what I have, or if what I have is not true, let me know that as well. But it seems to be the most solid. It seems to be like a paradox, because it's like the least provable thing that could possibly exist, but somehow it's a solid foundation. It is the realest thing that possibly exists somehow. Right. So, resurrection. There is a day ahead. With the time that you have, deny yourself and carry your cross. Deny yourself, carry your cross. Sacrifice leads to faith. Faith is optimism. Faith is greater than a belief. Faith will lead you to the resurrection.